The Art of Thinking Clearly. Written by Rolf Dobelli. Summarized by Detailed Book Summaries. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Chapter 1. Survivorship Bias. Don't take advice from the lucky. Have you ever stood in front of a mirror and asked yourself, what's stopping me from being wildly successful? Maybe you've scrolled through Instagram or picked up a book where some billionaire shares the secret to their rise. And in that moment, you felt like you'd cracked the code. If they could do it, why not you? We're drawn to success stories like moths to a flame. They're seductive. There's something about reading how a college dropout became the CEO of a billion-dollar company that makes us believe success is just a few smart moves away. And so we start taking notes. We mimic their habits, their morning routines, their philosophies. Wake up at 4:30 a.m.? Done. Meditate? Check. Cold showers? Bring it on. But there's a problem no one talks about. A dangerous, invisible bias that sits behind these stories like a puppeteer pulling strings. It's called survivorship bias. And it's quietly distorting the way we think about success, failure, and the choices we make. Let me tell you a story that might change the way you see this forever. Back in World War II, Allied bombers were being shot down at alarming rates. To reduce losses, engineers began studying the planes that returned from combat. They meticulously mapped out where each plane had been hit, the wings, the tail, the fuselage. The idea was simple. Reinforce the areas that had taken the most damage. But a man named Abraham Wald, a mathematician and statistician, had a completely different take. He said, "You're looking at this all wrong." Wald pointed out that they were analyzing only the planes that survived, the ones that made it back. What they weren't seeing were the planes that had been shot down. So those bullet holes, they represented the places where a plane could get hit and still survive. The real danger zones were the spots that had no bullet holes, likely the engines or cockpit, because if a plane got hit there, it didn't come back to tell the tale. This was one of the earliest documented examples of survivorship bias. It's what happens when we focus solely on the successes, the survivors, the ones who made it through, and ignore all the ones who didn't. It skews our understanding of reality. And here's the thing, we do this all the time. When we read about a successful startup founder who maxed out their credit cards and lived on ramen noodles, we often think that's what it takes. We don't see the thousands of others who did the same and ended up broke, in debt, and quietly dropped off the radar. Their stories aren't told. There's no TED Talk titled, "How I Tried Really Hard and Failed Miserably." We see the best-selling authors who wrote their first book on a typewriter in a basement and now live in a mansion. We don't see the thousands who poured their soul into a manuscript and got rejection after rejection, or never even heard back. We study the outliers and think they represent the norm. That's the dark magic of survivorship bias. It creates the illusion that the path to success is simple, even repeatable, when in fact it often isn't. What you're seeing is a tiny slice of the full picture. It's like watching only the gold medal highlights of the Olympics and thinking everyone can do a backflip off a balance beam. Now here's where this gets really dangerous. If you base your decisions on these skewed observations, you might end up chasing illusions. You might pour your life savings into a business idea just because someone else succeeded with it. You might quit your job convinced that taking risks is the answer, because you've heard 100 stories where that worked out. But you're not hearing from the people for whom it didn't. Think about it. Would you follow the exact same routine of a professional swimmer if your goal is to look like them? Maybe. But what if the swimmer didn't get that body from training? What if they were born with it and that's why they became a swimmer? This leads us into the next illusion, but we'll get there in Chapter 2. For now, let's stay with survivorship bias. It's not just about business or success. It's everywhere. Stock market advice? Based on the winners. Inspirational quotes? Cherry-picked from survivors. Motivational speakers? Most of them made it, and now they're telling you what worked for them. But do they really know if those same strategies would work again in a different time, place, or context? Do they ever show you the graveyard of similar attempts that failed? No, because failure is quiet. It doesn't sell. It doesn't inspire. It disappears into the shadows while success takes the stage. So how do we avoid falling into this trap? First, we have to ask the right questions. Whenever you hear a story of success, stop and ask, how many people tried this and didn't succeed? Try to uncover the data that isn't being shown. Study the failures as carefully as the successes, even more so if you can. There's more to learn in a postmortem than a victory speech. Second, flip your perspective. If you read about the top 10 habits of billionaires, ask yourself, do non-billionaires also have these habits? If they do, then those habits might not be the reason for the success at all. They could just be noise, a coincidence dressed up as cause and effect. And finally, remind yourself that real wisdom comes from seeing the whole picture. Not just the survivors, not just the winners, but the vast, often invisible crowd of those who tried and failed. Because they are the missing data points, the ones who reveal the full truth. I remember once I was reading this success story about a guy who built an app and became a millionaire in 2 years. I got so pumped I started sketching out my own app ideas. I was halfway through a business plan when it hit me. I hadn't read a single story of someone who built an app and failed. Not one. That was my wake-up call. It's not that you shouldn't dream. It's not that success is impossible. But if you base your strategy on a handful of survivors, you're flying blind, and you might not make it back to tell your story. So the next time you see someone standing on the winner's podium, smile for them, cheer for them, but don't forget to look around for the people who almost made it. The ones you never heard about. They've got lessons too, ones that just might save you from repeating their mistakes. Chapter 2, Swimmer's Body Illusion. Why the fitness industry is not really about fitness. Walk into any elite fitness club, and you'll notice something curious. The trainers are sculpted like statues, glistening with discipline and effort. Their muscles ripple, their posture is perfect, their smiles permanent. You might think, if I follow their routines, I'll look like them. That's the unspoken promise. But here's the trick. What if these trainers look the way they do not because of their training but because of their genetics, and it's their genetics that got them into this profession in the first place? This is the swimmer's body illusion. We tend to assume that the appearance of successful individuals is the result of their actions, when in fact their appearance may have been the reason they succeeded in that field. Olympic swimmers, for instance, don't necessarily have perfect bodies because they swim. It's often the other way around. They're world-class swimmers because their bodies are naturally built for it. Long torsos, short legs, wide shoulders, flexible joints. These physical traits give them a competitive edge in the water. The sport didn't shape them. Their bodies selected them for the sport. And yet, we fall for the illusion. We join swim classes hoping to look like Olympians. We follow diets promoted by athletes. We mimic the lifestyles of people who might simply be genetic outliers. The error lies not in trying, but in believing that effort alone can overcome structural differences that are rarely visible. Think about beauty contests. We assume that the winners must have incredible skincare routines or workout secrets, when in reality, they may just be genetically blessed. The same applies to Ivy League graduates. Do top schools produce successful individuals, or do they select for them? Are graduates successful because of their education, or because they were already talented, driven, and well-connected before ever stepping foot on campus? We confuse correlation with causation, appearance with process. The illusion spreads far beyond fitness. Cosmetic companies sell beauty by showing you models who've likely never needed makeup to look attractive. Self-help gurus sell transformation using stories of their own success, never acknowledging that their charisma, timing, or even sheer luck played major roles. It's easy to believe that what you're seeing is the outcome of discipline, method, and dedication, but often, it's a mirage built on selection bias. A popular university once advertised its MBA program using a smiling graduate who had just landed a prestigious job at a major consulting firm. The implication was clear. Study here and you too could land that job. But no one asked whether that student was already headed for that success with or without the degree. Maybe he had a powerful network. Maybe he was a prodigy long before stepping into the program. The university didn't make him successful. It chose him because he already was. This illusion blinds us in subtle daily ways. We see best-selling authors and think their success lies in their writing routine, not realizing their storytelling instinct might have been honed long before anyone noticed. We see social media influencers and think they've mastered the algorithm, overlooking the advantage of having a perfect jawline and early entry, or the right niche at the right time. Even in dating, we fall into the trap. We assume that the most attractive people must be doing something right, some special skincare, wardrobe tricks, or secret techniques, when often what they're doing is simply existing with a face that happens to align with societal beauty standards. The swimmer's body illusion is dangerous because it tempts us to chase outcomes that might not be replicable. It encourages mimicry over introspection. It fuels dissatisfaction because no matter how closely you follow the recipe, the dish never turns out quite the same. This doesn't mean improvement is impossible. It doesn't mean habits don't matter. They do. But we must understand where habits end and nature begins. Knowing the difference can save you years of misguided effort. If you're someone with a naturally broad frame and short limbs, you may never look like a professional swimmer, no matter how much you train. And that's okay because your body may be built for something else entirely. Recognizing that is not defeatist, it's clarity. So the next time you're lured by a before and after photo, pause. Ask yourself, is this a true transformation? Or was the after simply someone who was already genetically inclined to look this way? When a school, gym, or brand markets itself using its most dazzling alumni or users, ask, are they showcasing results or just their best raw materials? Question the model, not just the method. Understanding the swimmer's body illusion doesn't make you cynical. It makes you precise. It lets you see beyond the glitter of results and focus on causes. It frees you from blind imitation and points you toward authentic, sustainable growth. Not everyone is built to be an Olympian, but everyone can train intelligently within their own frame. That's the kind of wisdom that lasts longer than any trend or advertisement. Don't confuse the selection process with the outcome. The difference is vast, and once you see it, you'll never fall for the illusion again. Chapter 3, Clustering Illusion, Why You See Shapes in the Clouds. Look up at the sky on a lazy afternoon, and you might see a horse galloping through the clouds, or maybe a dragon curling across the horizon. None of it is really there, of course, it's just vapor, light, and your imagination filling in the blanks. But your brain doesn't care. It's desperate to make sense of randomness, to find patterns in the noise. That need, that compulsive hunger to see order where there is none, is the foundation of the clustering illusion. Imagine you're flipping a coin. Heads, then heads again, then a third head. By the fourth toss, your brain starts to twitch. Surely the next one must be tails, you think. But the coin doesn't care. The probability hasn't changed. Each toss is still 50-50, completely independent of the last. And yet, when randomness starts to repeat itself, when patterns seem to form, our brain starts to panic, as if randomness itself has rules it should be obeying. This illusion is especially powerful when we observe clusters of similar outcomes that, statistically, are perfectly normal. Let's say you see a roulette ball land on red 5 times in a row. You start thinking it has to be black next. Casinos thrive on this exact fallacy. But a sequence of reds doesn't make black any more likely. That red result? It's no less random than red. But it feels more suspicious. That feeling is the clustering illusion whispering to you. Our brains evolved to detect patterns because in nature, patterns often meant survival. If you notice that the same bush always rustled just before a predator pounced, identifying that pattern could save your life. But in the modern world, especially in data-rich environments, our pattern-seeking instincts lead us astray. We start seeing meaning in randomness. We connect dots that don't belong together. Think of sports fans. A basketball player makes 5 shots in a row and suddenly he's on fire. Coaches and fans both believe in the hot hand, a player who's temporarily invincible, riding a wave of luck and confidence. But studies have shown again and again, the hot hand is largely an illusion. Players on a streak don't shoot significantly better than usual. The pattern is a fluke, a natural occurrence in a random sequence. But to us it feels real, so real that we build strategies and decisions around it. The same goes for investing. You look at a stock chart and see it trending upward in what looks like a clear and confident line. You assume the trend will continue. You spot a pattern, and your instincts scream by now. But markets are chaotic, full of noise and driven by variables you can't see. What looks like a pattern may just be a cluster, a coincidence, and acting on it could cost you dearly. Even in our personal lives, the clustering illusion quietly manipulates our thinking. A string of bad luck? We feel cursed. A few good days in a row? We think we're on a roll. We assign meaning to sequences that don't deserve it. If we meet 3 rude people in a day, we may decide the world is turning cruel. But maybe we just happen to cross paths with 3 people having bad mornings. Randomness doesn't space itself out neatly. Sometimes it clumps. And when it clumps, we get confused. One of the most famous examples of this illusion comes from war. During the London Blitz in World War II, people were convinced that German bombs were targeting certain neighborhoods more than others. Patterns were noticed. Some areas seemed untouched, others devastated. Citizens assumed there was a method to the chaos. But when statisticians analyzed the bombing maps, they found the distribution of hits was completely random. The clusters were illusions, natural fluctuations that appeared meaningful only to the human eye. The clustering illusion is not harmless. It leads to conspiracy theories, false accusations, poor financial decisions, and superstitious behaviors. It drives us to chase phantom patterns, trends that don't exist but feel real. And the worst part? Once you believe you've spotted a pattern, your brain fights hard to defend it. So what can you do to resist? First, remember this: randomness clumps. It bunches up. It looks weird and uneven and unfair. That's what true randomness looks like. It's not perfectly spaced out or symmetrical. When you see an odd cluster, whether it's a string of good luck, bad luck, similar outcomes, or repeated events, stop yourself from assigning meaning. Pause. Ask, is this pattern statistically significant, or is it just noise? Second, trust numbers more than your gut. Emotions are great for empathy, storytelling, and connection, but they're terrible at probability. Your intuition wasn't built for coin tosses, stock charts, or complex data. When in doubt, rely on hard math and empirical analysis. And finally, be skeptical of anyone selling you a proven pattern, whether it's in business, finance, or life advice. Many of these so-called patterns are born from cherry-picked examples, survivorship bias, and a desperate urge to make the unpredictable feel predictable. People crave certainty, but certainty built on randomness is a dangerous illusion. Seeing shapes in the clouds can be beautiful, poetic, even. But when you start betting your future on those shapes, you're no longer watching clouds. You're building castles in the air. The world is full of clusters, flukes, and coincidences. That doesn't mean the universe is speaking to you. Sometimes it's just noise. And learning to tell the difference? That's the beginning of real clarity. Chapter 4: Social Proof: Why You Should Not Follow the Herd. You're walking down the street, looking for a place to eat. Two restaurants sit side by side. One is bustling with people, laughter, the clatter of forks, a line out the door. The other is nearly empty. Just one table in the back is taken, and the waiter stands bored at the entrance. Without thinking too hard, you pick the busy one. Something in you whispers, this place must be better. Everyone's here. That other spot must be doing something wrong. This is social proof at work, the subconscious belief that if others are doing it, it must be right. We humans are tribal by nature. From birth, we look to others to learn what's safe, what's valuable, what's correct. In childhood, we mimic speech, gestures, even preferences. As adults, we like to imagine we're more evolved, more independent, but that's often an illusion. When uncertainty strikes, or we don't have time or knowledge to analyze a situation, we look to others for clues. The bigger the group, the more convincing it feels. Social proof manifests everywhere: on social media, in fashion, in politics, in technology. When a post goes viral, people assume it's worth liking or sharing. When a book becomes a bestseller, we think it must be good. When a long line forms outside a club, we assume it's worth the wait. We often confuse popularity with value. This tendency becomes dangerous when the crowd is wrong. Consider the financial markets. A stock starts climbing. More people notice and buy in. The price rises further. More people rush in, not wanting to miss out. The herd becomes a stampede. But if the stock's rise isn't backed by fundamentals, if it's hype, not substance, the whole thing can collapse. This isn't just theoretical. It happened during the dot-com bubble, the housing crash, and countless smaller frenzies. The same dynamic drives crowd panics. Someone shouts fire in a theater. One person runs, then 5, then 50. Everyone runs, not because they see flames, but because others are running. The logic becomes, if they're fleeing, there must be danger. In some cases, this saves lives. But in others, it creates chaos from thin air. Social proof also governs morality and opinion. If the majority supports an idea, dissent becomes difficult. People suppress questions to avoid isolation. Entire societies have slipped into disaster because individuals followed the herd. From the madness of crowds to the horrors of totalitarian regimes. In the digital age, social proof is engineered. Platforms display likes, views, shares, comments, not just for fun but to manipulate perception. You're more likely to watch a video that already has 1 million views. Marketers know this and often use fake followers, bot reviews, and artificial scarcity to simulate popularity. But perhaps the most subtle form of social proof is in silence. When no one objects, we assume everyone agrees. This happens in meetings, in classrooms, in communities. No one raises their hand, so everyone stays quiet. It's the illusion of consensus, and it feeds on itself. So how do you break free from the herd? First, notice when you're deferring to the crowd. Is the restaurant good, or just busy? Is the product valuable, or just trending? Is the idea sound, or just popular? Ask yourself, would I choose this if no one else were watching? Second, seek out independent data. If everyone is piling into something, look for dissenting voices. Not to be contrarian for its own sake, but to balance your perspective. Wisdom isn't always in the majority. Finally, be okay with standing alone. Sometimes the right decision is unpopular. Sometimes silence hides agreement. Sometimes value isn't recognized until long after the crowd has moved on. Social proof isn't evil. It's just dangerous when you stop thinking for yourself. Chapter 5: Sunk Cost Fallacy: Why You Should Forget the Past. You've been watching a terrible movie for over an hour. The plot's a mess, the acting is wooden, and every minute feels like a punishment. You know it's bad. You want to stop. But you say to yourself, I've already watched half of it. I may as well finish it. And so you endure the last painful hour. This is the sunk cost fallacy in action. It happens when we continue with something. A movie, a meal, a relationship, a project. Not because it's good or rewarding, but because we've already invested time, money, or effort. That investment becomes a psychological trap. We cling to it, not wanting it to go to waste. But in reality, the cost is already gone. Nothing you do now will get it back. Rational decision-making is supposed to be forward-looking. We should ask, what will bring me the most value going forward? But the sunk cost fallacy makes us look backward. We let the past dictate the future, and that often leads to more waste, not less. Imagine someone who's started a business. After pouring in $50,000, the venture is clearly failing. Revenue is minimal, demand is non-existent, and every day brings more losses. Friends suggest pulling out, but the founder refuses. I've put too much in already to stop now, they say. So they continue, pouring in another $20,000 and eventually lose that too. The logic is emotional, not rational. We hate admitting that our previous efforts were in vain. Abandoning a project feels like admitting failure. But that's not how success works. Sometimes quitting is the smart choice. It frees up resources, time, money, energy that could be better used elsewhere. Governments and companies fall for this fallacy all the time. Billions have been spent on failing infrastructure, disastrous military campaigns, or broken tech systems, simply because leaders didn't want to write off the initial cost. It's the classic "we've come this far" mentality. But continuing a bad decision doesn't redeem the original mistake. It just deepens the damage. The sunk cost fallacy affects relationships too. People stay in loveless marriages or toxic friendships because they've been together for so long. They stay in careers they hate because they spent years getting degrees. But time already spent isn't a reason to keep going. It's a reason to reevaluate. The only thing that matters is whether the next step brings more value than the alternative. Recognizing this fallacy requires emotional courage. It means accepting loss, letting go, cutting ties. It often involves embarrassment, self-doubt, or disappointment. But it's also the mark of wisdom. People who succeed long-term know when to pivot, when to walk away, when to start over. So how do you guard against this trap? Start by reframing your mindset. Don't think of the investment as wasted. Think of it as tuition. You paid to learn something valuable. What doesn't work? That insight can guide you to better decisions. Next, ask yourself, if I hadn't invested anything in this already, would I still choose it today? That question cuts through the bias. If the answer is no, it's time to reconsider. Lastly, practice making clean decisions. Forget what's already spent. Focus on the next step. Ask, what path leads to the best outcome from here forward, regardless of how I got here? Letting go of sunk costs doesn't make you a quitter. It makes you someone who knows how to stop digging when you realize you're in the wrong hole. Chapter 6. Reciprocity. Why you shouldn't accept free drinks. You're sitting at a bar when someone sends over a drink. Maybe it's a stranger. Maybe it's a representative from a new company in town. Either way, it feels good. You smile, nod your thanks, maybe even raise your glass in a small toast. It's just a drink. A few sips of alcohol in a glass. Nothing more, right? But something shifts. Unseen. Quiet. Internal. You start to feel an urge to give something back. Maybe it's your attention. Maybe you feel obligated to talk. Or to buy the next round. That subtle pressure, that tickling itch of psychological imbalance, is the work of reciprocity. A deeply wired impulse that governs much of human behavior. Reciprocity is one of the oldest rules in the social contract. If someone gives you something you feel you owe them, it's what keeps societies functioning, friends connected, neighbors civil. But it can also be exploited, especially when your sense of gratitude becomes someone else's leverage. Think of the street performers who hand you a free bracelet, only to ask for a donation a moment later. Or charities that send you address labels or tiny gifts in the mail, hoping you'll feel obliged to return the favor with a check. Or the salesperson who offers you coffee, kindness, maybe even a small present before starting their pitch. All these are calculated moves, subtle manipulations of our reciprocity instinct. We like to think we give because we want to, but often we give because we feel we have to. This isn't a flaw, it's evolutionary. In early tribes, sharing resources and favors built trust and survival. Rejecting a gift meant social isolation. Over time, the impulse to reciprocate became automatic, an emotional reflex. But in today's world, reciprocity can make us vulnerable, especially in high-stakes decisions. In business negotiations, for example, small concessions can soften you up. A company offers a minor discount or throws in a bonus service, and suddenly, you're more likely to agree to a contract that benefits them more than you. You feel grateful. They seem generous. But the deal? It might not be in your best interest. Even in personal relationships, reciprocity plays tricks. Ever felt indebted to someone who listened to you vent? Who helped you move? Who watched your dog when you were out of town? Those favors can build goodwill, or they can become strings that tug at your choices later. Not all generosity is clean. Sometimes it comes with invisible expectations. So how do you protect yourself? First, slow down. When someone gives you something unexpectedly, pause. Ask yourself, is this truly a gift, or is it a setup? That awareness alone can disrupt the automatic urge to reciprocate. Second, separate the person from the favor. Just because someone did something nice doesn't mean they deserve your business, your money, or your time. Return favors voluntarily, not because you're trapped by guilt. Third, be especially cautious in professional or commercial settings. If you're offered something, a free trial, a discount, a small extra, consider whether it's part of a larger strategy. Probably is. And finally, don't feel rude for not returning every gesture. True generosity doesn't demand repayment. You can accept kindness with thanks and no obligation. Reciprocity is a beautiful human instinct. It builds bridges, mends wounds, and deepens trust. But when wielded by those who understand its power too well, it becomes a tool of manipulation. Don't fall for the free drink. Sometimes it's the most expensive thing you'll ever accept. Chapter 7. Confirmation Bias. Why you see only what you want to see. Imagine this: you believe that people from a certain town are rude. Then on your next trip there, a single shopkeeper snaps at you. See? You say, I knew it. You ignore the 6 friendly strangers you met earlier that day, because they don't fit the story you've already decided is true. This is confirmation bias. And it may be the most dangerous mental trap of them all. At its core, confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information that supports what we already believe, while ignoring or dismissing anything that contradicts us. It's the mental equivalent of holding a spotlight over what you want to see, while keeping the rest in the dark. This bias shapes everything from politics to science, relationships to religion. Once we've formed an opinion, our brains go to work defending it. We Google articles that support our views. We follow people on social media who echo our thoughts. We join communities where everyone agrees with us. And the more we hear our beliefs repeated, the more certain we become, not because they're more accurate, but because they're louder in our heads. Confirmation bias isn't just intellectual laziness, it's emotional comfort. Changing your mind hurts. It requires humility. It means admitting I might have been wrong. That's tough, especially when your identity, community, or sense of self is tied to your beliefs. And the smarter you are, the worse it gets. Intelligent people are better at rationalizing, at building convincing arguments, collecting data, and defending even weak ideas. They don't necessarily think more accurately, they just argue their point more persuasively, even to themselves. Confirmation bias isn't limited to individuals. Entire institutions fall victim. Consider companies that push forward with doomed strategies, ignoring evidence of failure, or governments that base policies on ideology rather than facts. Even science, the gold standard of objectivity, struggles. Researchers sometimes cherry-pick data to support hypotheses. Studies that confirm prevailing views are more likely to be published. Contradictory results? They often stay in the drawer. So what can you do? First, actively seek out disconfirming evidence. Ask, what would prove me wrong? Then go looking for it. Read opposing viewpoints. Talk to people you disagree with, not to win the argument but to understand their reasoning. Second, adopt the mindset of a scientist, not a lawyer. Lawyers build cases for one side. Scientists test theories. Be willing to test your ideas, and discard them if the data doesn't hold up. That's not weakness. It's wisdom. Third, separate identity from opinion. Your beliefs are not who you are. They are tools, maps, approximations. If a belief no longer serves you or turns out to be false, let it go. You're not betraying yourself. You're evolving. And finally, be skeptical of certainty, especially your own. Confidence often masquerades as truth, but truth is subtle, layered, often elusive. The more sure you feel, the more you should pause and ask, am I seeing the full picture? Or just the part one want to see? Confirmation bias is a silent thief. It steals clarity, insight, growth. It keeps you locked in an echo chamber, hearing your own thoughts bounce back at you like gospel. If you want to think clearly, you must be brave enough to challenge your own mind. To say, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's more. And to listen, truly listen when the answers surprise you. Chapter 8. Authority Bias. Why you shouldn't bow to authority. A man walks into a lab coat and suddenly becomes a prophet. It sounds absurd when said aloud, but in the real world, it's terrifyingly accurate. Dress someone in the costume of authority, a uniform, a title, a certificate on the wall, and our judgment starts to blur. We obey more, question less. Our critical thinking bends in the presence of perceived expertise. This is the authority bias. And it's one of the most dangerous illusions, not because it's always wrong, but because it often feels so right. One of the most chilling demonstrations of authority bias came from a famous experiment in the 1960s. Psychologist Stanley Milgram wanted to understand how ordinary people could be led to commit atrocious acts, like those seen in wartime. He designed an experiment where volunteers were asked to administer electric shocks to another person when they answered questions incorrectly. The shocks weren't real, but the subjects didn't know that. As the supposed shocks intensified, the person in the next room screamed, begged, even fell silent. And yet, many participants continued, simply because the man in the white lab coat said, "Please continue." 2/3 of them went all the way, delivering what they thought was a fatal shock. Not because they were sadists, not because they lacked empathy, but because they deferred to authority. The lesson is clear. We often override our own moral compass when someone we perceive as an expert tells us what to do. In day-to-day life, this bias plays out more subtly. Doctors make recommendations and patients rarely ask questions. CEOs suggest a strategy and teams fall in line. A best-selling author proposes a wild theory, and readers nod in agreement. The more powerful or credentialed the person, the more unquestioned their influence. But authority doesn't equal accuracy. History is full of confident leaders who led their people into disaster. Experts in every field have been wrong, spectacularly wrong, from economics to medicine, politics to science. Even Nobel laureates have made disastrous predictions. The problem isn't authority itself. It's our automatic, unthinking submission to it. We assume that titles, uniforms, and reputations come with infallibility. We mistake confidence for competence. But credentials are not proof of correctness, they're just indicators. Sometimes useful, sometimes not. The pharmaceutical industry knows this well. When they advertise a drug, they use doctors in white coats speaking in serious tones. It doesn't matter if the actor is a real physician. What matters is the illusion. The image of authority makes you trust what they're saying, even if you barely understand the side effects they're listing. In classrooms and lecture halls, the same effect can stifle curiosity. A professor makes a bold claim, and no one raises a hand to challenge it. Why would they? The professor has decades of experience. But experience doesn't make one immune to bias, error, or oversight. In relationships, too, authority bias can warp dynamics. A parent insists they know best. A partner claims their way is the right way. The stronger their presence, the harder it is to push back. The bias makes you shrink from questioning, even when your instincts tell you something's off. So how do we resist the pull? First, learn to separate the person from the position. Someone might hold power, experience, or fame, but that doesn't mean their ideas are beyond scrutiny. Challenge the idea, not the individual. If they're secure in their knowledge, they'll welcome good questions. Second, examine the evidence yourself. Don't let credentials short-circuit your curiosity. If a financial advisor recommends a plan, ask how it works. If a doctor prescribes something, ask about side effects. If a public figure makes a claim, check the data. Authority should inspire inquiry, not suppress it. Third, recognize the cues that trigger the bias. Uniforms, titles, formal language, tone. These are all symbols, not truths. Just because someone looks authoritative doesn't mean they're right. Don't be hypnotized by the costume. Finally, remember that true experts admit uncertainty. The wisest authorities speak carefully. They acknowledge complexity, nuance, doubt. If someone claims absolute certainty, be skeptical, especially if their message demands obedience over understanding. Authority bias doesn't just threaten individual choices, it can corrupt entire systems. When people stop questioning those in charge, mistakes go unchallenged. Abuse goes unchecked. Institutions rot from within, all while everyone nods in silent agreement. Respect authority but don't worship it. Trust expertise but verify the logic. Ask questions. Challenge assumptions. Use your mind even when the person in front of you seems bigger, smarter, more experienced. Clear thinking requires courage, especially when the room is full of uniforms. Chapter 9: Contrast Effect. Why you shouldn't judge a book by its cover or its price tag. Picture this. You walk into a high-end boutique and see a sleek leather jacket with a $1,200 price tag. You scoff, of course. No way. But then, right beside it, there's a second jacket, almost as nice but priced at $450. Suddenly, that second jacket feels like a bargain, a steal even. Your mind whispers, this one's reasonable. You might even buy it, not because it's cheap, but because it's cheaper than the first. That's the contrast effect at work, a subtle psychological nudge that skews your perception by comparing one thing to another, often leading you away from true value. You don't judge things in isolation. Rarely. Instead, you assess them by comparing them to what came before, the thing beside it, the person before them, the price before this one. And it's not limited to shopping. It shows up everywhere. Take interviews, for instance. Let's say a hiring manager sees 3 candidates in a row. The first is exceptional, articulate, confident, well-dressed. The second is average. The third is also average. But here's the twist. The third candidate comes off better if they follow someone mediocre than if they follow someone brilliant. Same person, different contrast. That slight shift changes perceptions. It changes decisions. Our minds are wired to anchor. When we see or experience something first, we latch onto it. Then we evaluate the next thing in comparison, not on its own merits but relative to the anchor. That's why real estate agents show you a rundown house before showing you the one they really want to sell. The second one shines brighter by comparison. Even if it's still overpriced, even if it has flaws, it feels better than the dump you saw before it. And that feeling is where the contrast effect hooks you. Imagine you've been walking in the scorching sun for hours. You finally step into a room with a fan. Feels heavenly. Now enter the same room from an air-conditioned lounge. It'll feel warm, maybe even stifling. The room didn't change. Your reference point did. That's the secret to how contrast distorts truth. It shifts your baseline. The effect plays tricks with perception, and not just in material terms. Think of relationships. Someone dates a toxic partner, dishonest, cold, critical. Then they meet someone emotionally distant but not outright harmful. That new person feels like a breath of fresh air. They seem kind by contrast, even though they might still be lacking the emotional support a relationship needs. But compared to what came before, they look like a saint. We see it in job offers too. Say you're working a job that pays peanuts and demands weekends. Then someone offers you a position with just slightly more money and marginally better hours. You might take it with gratitude, not because it's amazing, but because it's better than the hell you just left. That's the danger of contrast. It sets the bar based on circumstance, not standards. The implications are everywhere. Marketers manipulate it relentlessly. First, they offer a premium version that's absurdly expensive. Then they reveal a standard version that suddenly feels acceptable, even appealing. You didn't want to spend $450, but after seeing the $1,200 jacket, you're somehow okay with it. They've set your expectations. Your resistance drops. You buy. So how do you escape the trap? First, pause and isolate the object. Try to judge it on its own. Ask, would I still want this if I hadn't seen the alternative first? Strip away the comparison and evaluate the thing itself, not the anchor next to it. Second, be aware of artificial contrast. If someone shows you a horrible option before the real offer, they're probably anchoring you. Politicians do it. Salespeople do it. Even friends do it, like when they ask for a huge favor first just to make the smaller one seem more reasonable. Third, reverse the roles. If you're presenting something, a business pitch, a project, an idea, consider how people might compare it. What will it be measured against? Can you control the order in which things are seen? Framing matters. Order matters. Perception is not fixed, it's contextual. Finally, understand this. The contrast effect is natural. It's human. It evolved to help us make quick decisions in a complex world. But when left unchecked, it leads to poor choices, distorted value, and regrets. Just because something seems better than the last thing doesn't mean it's good. It might just be less bad. We're constantly being nudged by marketers, managers, even our own memories to see things not as they are, but as they appear in contrast to something else. And when you start noticing that pattern, you gain power. The power to choose without manipulation, to assess without illusion. So next time you're tempted to say, this one's better, stop and ask, better than what? Because clarity begins when the comparison ends. Chapter 10. Availability Bias. Why we overestimate the importance of what comes easily to mind. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the most dangerous thing you can think of. What came up first? A terrorist attack? A plane crash? A violent robbery? Now think statistically. What are the actual odds of those things happening to you personally today or even this year? Welcome to the strange world of the availability bias. A mind trap that makes you overestimate the probability of events that are easily recalled. And more often than not, those events are sensational, frightening, or emotionally charged. Your brain is lazy, not in a bad way, but in an efficient way. It prefers shortcuts. And so when you're asked to estimate how likely something is, your brain goes to its mental filing cabinet and pulls out the first example it can find. If a story or event is vivid, recent, or dramatic, it's sitting right on top of that mental stack. That's what makes it feel more true, more real, more likely. The news plays a powerful role in shaping this. If you've recently seen footage of a devastating flood, you're more likely to overestimate the chances of another one happening soon, even if the actual risk hasn't changed. If a celebrity dies of a rare disease, that disease suddenly feels like a looming threat, even though millions quietly die of far more common ones. The bias doesn't care about numbers. It cares about images, emotion, recall. It's why people are terrified of flying but casually hop into cars every day, even though driving is statistically far more dangerous. When a plane goes down, it makes headlines, it dominates the news cycle, it stays with us. When a fatal car crash happens down the street, it might barely register, even though it's far more probable. The availability bias isn't just about fear, though. It affects every area of life. In investing, people chase stocks that have been in the news, especially if there's been a massive surge. They assume the surge will continue. It went up 30% last week. Surely it'll rise again. But they're not assessing the fundamentals or the valuation. They're just remembering the story. the one that burned brightly in their mind. In relationships, if you just watched a rom-com or saw a friend's social media post about the perfect anniversary, you're more likely to feel dissatisfied with your own love life. Not because anything has changed, but because that image is fresh and vivid in your mind. Even in business decisions, managers tend to rely on stories they've just heard. A recent success, a competitor's move, a memorable failure. Instead of diving into data, they trust the most available information. It feels intuitive, familiar, like a shortcut to insight. But it's often a shortcut to error. And in politics, well, the availability bias might be the most powerful tool in the playbook. Politicians and media outlets know how to stoke fear or hope by repeating certain stories again and again until they feel inevitable. Mention crime on repeat and people will think it's rising, even if it's statistically dropping. Talk about immigration crises every night, and people will assume it's the greatest threat, even if the data tells a different story. So how do you protect yourself? First, recognize that ease of recall does not equal importance. Just because something is at the top of your mind doesn't mean it's common or relevant. It may just be emotionally sticky. Second, dig for the data. When you hear about a risk, a danger, a trend, ask yourself, what are the actual numbers? If something feels like a threat, verify it. Find the baseline. Don't let the media or your own memories inflate the risk. Third, broaden your inputs. If all your information comes from one or two sources, you're likely seeing the same kinds of stories over and over again. That makes certain narratives feel truer than they are. Diversity of information leads to better balanced thinking. Fourth, when making decisions, especially big ones, pause and ask, am I reacting to what's memorable or what's meaningful? Did I choose this option because it's the best one? Or just the one I saw on LinkedIn yesterday? Even our conversations shape this bias. If a friend tells you a story about getting scammed online, you might become more paranoid about internet fraud. That's not irrational, but it's disproportionate. One story becomes your new reference point. And finally, remember, just because something makes a great story doesn't make it likely. The world isn't made up of headlines. It's made up of patterns, data, and probabilities, most of which are quiet, unsexy, and unseen. The availability bias turns us into reactive, emotional thinkers. It makes us worry about the wrong risks, chase the wrong trends, and overcorrect for flukes. But once you see it, once you recognize how your mind defaults to what's loudest instead of what's truest, you gain a little more clarity. And clarity is where thinking clearly begins. Chapter 11. It'll get worse before it gets better fallacy. Why things often look worse before they improve. Have you ever found yourself justifying a bad decision or a failing project by saying, it's always darkest before the dawn? It's a comforting thought, isn't it? The idea that any dip in fortune is just the storm before the calm. That we just have to endure the pain a little longer before the payoff finally comes. But here's the question. Is that dip actually a prelude to progress? Or a warning sign we're ignoring? Welcome to the it'll get worse before it gets better fallacy, a seductive and often dangerous bias that convinces us that short-term suffering must be a necessary stage on the path to long-term gain. Let's imagine a simple scenario. You've hired a new consultant to revamp your company's processes. The first few months, chaos, deadlines slip, costs rise, morale dips. But the consultant assures you, this is normal. It always gets worse before it gets better. You nod. Of course, that makes sense. But what if it just gets worse? What if the worse is the new normal? And there's no better around the corner. This fallacy is dangerous because it reframes failure as progress. It turns negative feedback into fuel for false hope. And it's extremely hard to argue against. How do you prove that things won't get better eventually? You can't. And that's exactly what makes it so persistent. This belief is rooted in a very human tendency. We hate to abandon ship after we've invested time, money, and energy. We like to think of ourselves as committed, patient, persevering. But often we're just stuck in a mental trap, clinging to an idea, a person, a business, or a decision simply because we hope the payoff will justify the pain. We see it in the stock market all the time. An investor buys a declining stock and watches it fall. Instead of cutting losses, they double down. This is temporary. It's just a dip. But the dip turns into a dive. The longer they hold, the harder it is to let go, because doing so would mean admitting they were wrong. We see it in relationships too. You've probably known someone or been someone who stayed in a toxic relationship with the idea that this is just a phase. Maybe after the wedding, after the baby, after therapy, things will improve. It's a comforting script. But sometimes the dysfunction isn't a bump on the road. It's the road itself. The same mindset affects governments and companies. Leaders often defend bad policies or broken systems by saying things must get worse before they get better. And yes, sometimes that's true. Progress can be messy. Transitions can be painful. But how do we separate necessary discomfort from avoidable disaster? The fallacy becomes most dangerous when it's used to delay action. It offers a psychological cushion to avoid hard decisions. Managers hang on to failing teams. Investors ride losing trades. Politicians double down on ineffective programs. The excuse? We're still in the painful phase. So how can we guard against this thinking trap? Start by asking a simple but powerful question. What evidence do I have that things will improve? Other than hope? Is there a proven model? A tested method? A track record that supports the belief in a turnaround? Or is it just wishful thinking disguised as optimism? Next, apply the principle of feedback loops. Are you getting measurable signs of progress beneath the surface? Even if the top-level metrics look worse, are there indicators that show growth, learning, or alignment with your long-term vision? Also, consider alternative explanations. What if this isn't the darkness before the dawn, but the darkness before total collapse? What would you do differently if that were true? Playing devil's advocate with your own assumptions helps cut through the fog of self-delusion. And finally, impose time limits. Set a deadline for when you expect things to improve, and commit to reassessing at that point. If the situation still hasn't changed, give yourself permission to walk away. Faith is a beautiful thing. But when it becomes blind, it turns into a trap. One of the hardest truths to accept is this. Sometimes things don't get better. They just get worse. And holding on, waiting for the miracle, only drains more time, energy, and resources. Clear thinking means having the courage to let go of bad investments, failed ideas, and painful illusions. Not all discomfort is a sign of progress. Sometimes it's just discomfort. And the faster we recognize that, the more energy we can redirect into paths that actually lead somewhere. Believing that things will improve simply because they're bad now is a comforting story. But it's still just a story. Thinking clearly means stepping back, checking the data, questioning the narrative, and daring to say, maybe this isn't going to get better. Because sometimes clarity comes not from pushing through the storm, but from choosing a different direction altogether. Chapter 12. The Story Bias. Why stories are irresistible but often misleading. Imagine sitting around a campfire. The flames flicker, the night is quiet, and someone begins to speak. There once was a young boy who set out on a journey. Without even realizing it, your full attention locks in. The words become images. The story pulls you in. You forget the world around you. There's something deep in our wiring, ancient and irresistible, that makes stories magical. But here's the catch. That same magic can cloud our judgment. Welcome to the story bias, where neat narratives override messy truth. The human brain craves structure. We want beginnings, middles, and ends. We want heroes, villains, conflicts, resolutions. We want to make sense of the world. And the easiest way to do that is by turning complex realities into simple stories. But the moment we do, something dangerous happens. We distort reality to fit the narrative. Consider a company that's just seen its stock price double in 6 months. The media scrambles to explain it. The CEO is a visionary, they say. The team is innovative, their strategy flawless. They'll trace the rise to clever decisions, strong leadership, bold moves. But what if the surge was just due to speculation? Or an industry bubble? Or dumb luck? Now imagine the same company's stock crashes. Suddenly, those very same qualities are reinterpreted. The CEO is reckless. The strategy was flawed. They overreached. It's the exact same company. But now the story has flipped, and our brain edits the facts to fit the new plotline. That's the danger of the story bias. It makes us overconfident in our understanding of cause and effect. We do this in our own lives too. When something goes right, we weave a tale of smart choices and personal growth. I got that job because I nailed the interview and made all the right moves. When things go wrong, we tell a different story. It was politics. Bad luck. Unfair timing. Rarely do we admit how much randomness was involved, how much was outside our control. But randomness doesn't make a good story. He succeeded because of market conditions and statistical luck isn't a headline anyone wants to read. He hustled, he believed in himself, he persevered. Now that's a story. Think about how we treat entrepreneurs. The ones who made it big, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, Oprah, we treat them like geniuses. We comb their childhoods, their habits, their decisions, trying to reverse engineer their success. But what about the thousands who took similar risks and failed? Where are their profiles? The stories we tell about success are full of survivorship bias. Only the winners are visible, so their journey gets mythologized. The truth is often far less romantic. Luck, timing, market forces, hidden variables. But that version doesn't feel satisfying. It doesn't give us a takeaway, a moral. So we discard it. Here's a chilling example. During the Iraq War, a group of U.S. generals believed that a particular bombing strategy would crush insurgent resistance. When casualties rose instead, they told themselves a story. The enemy is desperate. That's why they're fighting harder. The reality? The bombings were fueling more recruits to the insurgency. But the generals stuck to their narrative, and the war dragged on. That's how dangerous stories can be. Once we're locked into one, we bend every new fact to support it. We ignore contradictions. We fill in blanks with assumptions. We cling to coherence, even at the expense of truth. The media does this constantly. A celebrity's rise is turned into an underdog tale. A politician's fall becomes a Shakespearean tragedy. Financial journalists write post hoc explanations for why the market moved a certain way, as if it weren't influenced by a million invisible threads. The truth might be we don't really know why, but that doesn't sell. So how do we protect ourselves from the story bias? First, get comfortable with uncertainty. Not every event has a neat cause. Not every outcome is the result of brilliant or stupid decisions. Sometimes things just are. I don't know is a powerful, honest stance. Second, learn to separate data from narrative. Look at the facts before attaching a story. Ask, what do I actually know? What am I assuming? What am I filling in just to make it make sense? Third, seek counter-narratives. If someone tells you a story that sounds too tidy, ask, what's the opposite story someone else could tell with the same facts? Playing devil's advocate exposes the blind spots in our favorite plots. Finally, remember that truth is often messy. Real life isn't a Hollywood movie. It's nonlinear. Sometimes it's random. Sometimes the villain wins. Sometimes there's no moral. That doesn't make it meaningless. It makes it real. Stories are beautiful, powerful, essential. They help us connect, remember, empathize. But they are not truth. They are interpretations of truth. The moment we forget that, we become easy to fool, especially by ourselves. So the next time someone gives you a slick story about success, failure, history, politics, or even your own life, pause. Ask, is this the truth, or just a really good story? And then think again. Chapter 13, Hindsight Bias. Why you knew it all along but didn't. Think back to the last time something unexpected happened. A sports team you were sure would win that lost instead. A political candidate who shocked everyone. A tech stock that soared or plummeted. What did you tell yourself afterward? I knew it. I had a feeling. It was obvious. But was it? Really? Let's talk about one of the most deceptive tricks your mind plays on you. The hindsight bias. It's the illusion, after an event has occurred, that we somehow knew it all along. Feels good to believe that. It gives us the illusion of control, of foresight, of intelligence. But in reality, we're rewriting the past. Let me paint the scene. You're watching the news the night after an election. The winning candidate wasn't the favorite. But the analysts explain it perfectly. The shift in suburban votes, the last-minute turnout among young people, the messaging around jobs. Suddenly it all makes sense. You nod. Of course, you think. It was bound to happen. But rewind 24 hours. You were nervous. No one knew for sure. The same outcome was unclear, chaotic. What's changed? Only this, it already happened. And because it happened, your brain constructs a narrative to make it feel inevitable. That's hindsight bias in action. This bias shows up everywhere. In history books. In boardrooms. In courtrooms. In classrooms. When we look back, we not only overestimate how predictable an outcome was, But we also convince ourselves that we personally foresaw it. We trick ourselves into believing we're more intuitive, more intelligent, more strategic than we really were. And that can be dangerous. Think of investors. A company misses its earnings target, and its stock drops. Investors shake their heads and say, well, they expanded too fast. You could see it coming. But could you? If the stock had risen instead, they'd say, their bold expansion strategy paid off. Same facts, different outcomes. Our explanations bend around the result. Or take military decisions. After the 9/11 attacks, people scrutinized U.S. intelligence agencies. How could they have missed it? They said. All the signs were there. And yes, there were signs, but they were buried among thousands of other vague, conflicting signals. To say it was obvious after the fact is to pretend that clarity existed in the chaos. We even do this in our personal lives. A relationship ends. I should have seen it coming, you say. You recall every red flag, every argument, and stitch them together into a perfect chain of evidence. But at the time, love blurred the warnings. Hope outweighed doubt. The future was uncertain. You're only seeing clearly now because you're looking backward. So why do we do this? Part of it is evolutionary. Our minds crave order. The world is full of noise, and hindsight bias helps us make sense of it. If we can believe we understood what happened, we feel less vulnerable, less exposed to randomness. It's a form of self-soothing. Another part is ego. If we tell ourselves we saw things coming, we feel smart. We can preserve our self-image as perceptive, insightful. It's easier to claim foresight than to admit surprise. But there's a cost. Hindsight bias distorts learning. It prevents us from accurately analyzing decisions and outcomes. If we convince ourselves that an outcome was predictable, we're less likely to examine the real variables at play. We oversimplify. We miss the nuances. We stop asking, what did I miss? Because we pretend we didn't miss anything. In medicine, this bias can be deadly. After a misdiagnosis, people will say, it was clearly a brain tumor. How could they miss it? But in real time, the symptoms could have pointed to dozens of possibilities. The doctor made a call with limited information. Judging them through the lens of hindsight is unfair and unhelpful. And it's not just about blaming others. We often blame ourselves with hindsight too. Why did I take that job? I should have known it wouldn't work out. But we didn't know. We had hopes, reasons, maybe even red flags, but we made the best decision we could with what we had. Hindsight bias can turn honest decisions into imagined mistakes. So how do we protect ourselves? One powerful habit is to document your thinking in real time. Write down your predictions, your reasoning, your expectations before events unfold. Then, when things turn out differently, revisit your notes. This keeps you honest. It shows you what you really knew and what you didn't. Another strategy is to resist the urge to say, I knew it. Instead ask, did I really? What evidence did I have at the time? Was the outcome truly inevitable? Remind yourself that just because something happened doesn't mean it had to happen, or that it was obvious. Also, when evaluating decisions, yours or others, separate the process from the outcome. A good decision can lead to a bad result. A bad decision can lead to a good result. Don't let hindsight rewrite the quality of the thinking that went into a choice. Hindsight bias makes life feel neater. It gives the illusion that the world is understandable and controllable. But if we let it rule us, we become blind to uncertainty. We stop preparing for surprises. We overrate our abilities and underestimate risk. Life is unpredictable. That's not a flaw, it's a feature. Embracing that truth makes us wiser, humbler, and ultimately better decision makers. So the next time you're tempted to say, I knew it all along, stop, take a breath, rewind, reconsider, and think again. Chapter 14, The Overconfidence Effect, Why You Systematically Overestimate Your Knowledge. Picture this. You're watching a quiz show. The contestant is asked a tricky question. Maybe something obscure about Renaissance art, or the chemical composition of a planet. They hesitate, then say, I'm 95% sure the answer is Venus. The host reveals the correct answer. It's Mercury. Oops. Not just wrong, but wrong with confidence. Sound familiar? That's the overconfidence effect at work. We all like to think we're pretty accurate judges of what we know. But the truth is we're not. In fact, we're frequently way too sure of ourselves. We overestimate our knowledge, our skills, our predictions. And we do it so often, in so many areas, that it's practically a feature of being human, not a bug. Let me ask you this. How sure are you right now that you'd beat the average person at driving? Or at recognizing fake news? Or managing money? Most people, when asked, rate themselves as above average in almost every domain, which of course is statistically impossible. That's the overconfidence effect. The tendency to believe we know more than we actually do, and to assign overly high probabilities to our own judgments being correct. It affects experts and amateurs alike. Studies have shown that doctors, engineers, CEOs, even weather forecasters, routinely overrate the accuracy of their decisions and predictions. For instance, when people say they're 99% sure of something, they're wrong about 20% of the time. That's a staggering gap between certainty and truth. So why do we do this? Why are we so sure we're right, even when we're not? The answer lies deep in our wiring. First, our brains crave coherence. We like stories that make sense, and we like to feel in control. Overconfidence helps maintain that illusion of certainty, that we understand how the world works. It reduces anxiety. Doubt is uncomfortable. Certainty is soothing, even if it's false. Second, we tend to remember our successes and forget our failures. If you correctly guessed a stock would rise, that moment sticks with you. The 5 other times you guessed wrong, they fade. Our memories are selective, and they tilt the scale toward a rosier view of our judgment. Then there's ego. Admitting we don't know something makes us feel vulnerable. So instead, we lean into confidence, not because we are right, but because we want to feel right. And it gets worse. The more complex the question, the more confident we often become. You'd think we'd be more cautious in uncertain situations, but no. Complexity gives us room to insert our opinions, assumptions, and biases, and to then believe in them with even more conviction. The consequences of overconfidence can be enormous. In business, CEOs launch risky ventures with exaggerated projections, only to see them fail spectacularly. In medicine, doctors misdiagnose patients because they're too confident in their first impression. In law, eyewitnesses testify with total certainty and are completely mistaken. In war, leaders go into battle expecting a quick victory, underestimating the enemy, and ignoring warning signs. Overconfidence isn't just a quirk. It's a risk factor. It causes us to overlook information, to dismiss alternatives, and to double down when we should pull back. And here's the twist. Being knowledgeable doesn't protect you from this bias. In fact, the more expertise someone has, the more certain they often become, and the less they're willing to admit they could be wrong. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows that beginners may not even recognize how little they know, while seasoned experts fall into the trap of thinking they know everything. So how do we protect ourselves from the overconfidence trap? Start by building a margin of doubt into your thinking. When you make a judgment about the market, a decision, a forecast, ask yourself, how sure am I really? Then challenge that answer. What would change your mind? What don't you know? What's your blind spot? Use probabilistic thinking. Instead of saying this will happen, say, there's a 60% chance it will happen. Then track your forecasts over time. Are you as accurate as you believe? Calibrating your confidence with your actual outcomes is one of the most humbling and enlightening exercises you can do. Invite dissent. Overconfidence thrives in echo chambers. If you're surrounded by people who always agree with you, your confidence will grow unchecked. But if you encourage disagreement and truly listen to it, you'll expose the cracks in your thinking and make better decisions. And perhaps most importantly, learn to say these powerful words. I don't know. There's no shame in it. In fact, it's a sign of maturity, wisdom, and humility. Not knowing opens the door to curiosity. It keeps your mind open. It makes you more accurate in the long run. Being confident isn't the problem. Being blindly confident is. So the next time you feel 100% sure about something, pause. Ask, am I sure? Or just sure feeling? Challenge your certainty. Invite doubt. Respect complexity. Because in a world that's constantly shifting, the ability to question your own confidence might just be the smartest move you can make. Let's stay curious and grounded. Chapter 15. The Show for Knowledge, Why experts sometimes get it wrong. Imagine this. You're at a lavish event, and a well-dressed man steps onto the stage. He delivers a flawless speech, confident tone, smooth gestures, perfectly memorized lines. The crowd erupts in applause. He looks every bit the expert. But there's a secret. He's not the real deal. He's just reciting someone else's work, like a chauffeur driving a car he didn't build. This is chauffeur knowledge, the illusion of expertise without the actual depth. It's when someone talks like an authority, but underneath the surface, they don't fully understand what they're saying. And it's more common than you think. To explain this idea, Dobelli retells the story of Max Planck, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist. After giving the same lecture countless times across Germany, his chauffeur jokingly suggested, "I've heard your talk so often, I could give it myself." Planck agreed, and in a playful switch, the chauffeur delivered the lecture, and nailed it. That is, until someone in the audience asked a question. Stuck, the chauffeur pointed to Max Planck, now in disguise, and said, "That question is so simple, I'll let my chauffeur answer it." It's a funny story but also revealing. There are two kinds of knowledge, the deep, foundational kind like Planck's, and the surface-level kind, polished, rehearsed, but empty like the chauffeur's. And in today's world, chauffeur knowledge is everywhere. Turn on the TV and watch a panel of pundits debate economics, technology, politics. They speak with confidence, but often they're just echoing headlines and sound bites, not years of hard-earned experience. On social media, influencers dish out expert advice on everything from mental health to investing, backed more by charisma than credentials. But why is this dangerous? Because we trust appearances. We equate eloquence with expertise. When someone speaks fluently and confidently, our brains take a shortcut and assume they know what they're talking about. It's the same psychological bias that makes us trust good-looking people more, even if they have nothing to back it up. The problem is, chauffeur knowledge can't handle pressure. The moment something unpredictable happens, a tough question, a real-world complication, the illusion cracks. Just like the chauffeur on stage. This becomes critical in decision-making. Think of a CEO dazzled by a consultant using big buzzwords and a slick presentation. If the consultant is just parroting frameworks they don't deeply understand, the company could be steered into a costly mistake. Or consider a politician delivering rehearsed lines on climate policy, but with no grasp of the underlying science. When the moment comes to make a crucial decision, style won't save them, substance will. And here's something even more alarming. We can fall into the chauffeur trap ourselves. Have you ever repeated a phrase, maybe about economics, psychology, or even history, just because you've heard it enough? Maybe it sounded smart and you wanted to fit in. But if someone pressed for details, you'd be exposed. We all do it. We absorb fragments of knowledge from books, podcasts, and videos, and if we're not careful, we begin to mistake familiarity for understanding. We start to sound like we know things even when we don't. So how do we avoid becoming chauffeur thinkers? First, develop what Dobelli calls Planck knowledge, deep understanding. This takes time, curiosity, and humility. Ask why more often. Don't stop at the surface. Learn from first principles, the foundational truths that support an idea. Second, practice the Feynman technique. Take a concept you think you understand, and try to explain it in simple language, as if teaching it to a child. If you get stuck, that's a signal. You've found a gap in your knowledge. Third, embrace intellectual humility. It's okay to say, "I don't know." In fact, it's a strength. When you admit what you don't know, you protect yourself from false confidence, and you open the door to real learning. Fourth, don't confuse presentation with expertise. Just because someone speaks well doesn't mean they know more than you. Be skeptical of polish. Ask tough questions. Look for depth, not just dazzle. And finally, be on guard when you are in the spotlight. If you're in a situation where you're tempted to lean on polished phrases instead of genuine insight, pause. Go back and fill in the gaps. Don't be the chauffeur pretending to be the physicist. In a world flooded with information, the ability to distinguish real understanding from superficial performance is a kind of superpower. And the more we can cultivate Planck knowledge and spot chauffeur knowledge, the better decisions we'll make. Remember, confidence without comprehension is a dangerous thing. Let's be the builders of the car, not just the drivers.